Welcome to Origins, the podcast where we dive into the VC ecosystem and learn how the people behind the capital, both LPs and GPs, make decisions. Hey, Beezer.
Hey, I'm Beezer Clarkson, partner at Sapphire Partners.
And I'm Nick Chirls, co-founder of Notation and also the founder of a new unannounced venture capital firm, which I'm not going to talk about in detail just yet, but I'll have more to say on that soon, maybe on this podcast. So.
Looking forward to it. In the meantime, while we wait for Nick's new announcement, we have Will Quist, partner at Slow Ventures, and Jason Shuman, a general partner at Primary, to come in and answer what should always be, but has become even more relevant recently, a pretty fundamental question of what is the real value add of VCs? And maybe one day we'll do a podcast called What is the Real Value Add of LPs? But today we're going to talk about the VCs.
Well, maybe we'll get a tidbit from you too on the LPs. I'm insanely excited actually about this podcast. I think there is a very timely, relevant debate happening in venture. Perhaps this is like a post-ZERP era thing. But I think that, and maybe in reaction also to like the big venture platforms that have been built. But on the one hand, right, there's like these big platforms across every function, and they're obviously pitching to founders and to LPs that they add tremendous value to these companies. And on the other hand, there are firms that think most of that is bullshit, excuse my language. And really the only thing matters is working with the right founders, picking the right companies, and sort of getting out of the way. It feels like the pendulum has swung on either side a bunch of different times over the last 10 or 15 years. And now it's maybe swung like back to maybe just get out of the way, or at least closer from the big VC value add platforms. So we have two investors, Jason and Will, who I think will represent, we'll see, but I think perhaps will represent each of those sides. Maybe not like the far ends of those sides, but I think they'll have different perspectives on how VCs can and like should work with founders. And so, yeah, I'm super excited about this episode. I've also personally like swung on that pendulum over the years. And so I'm excited to hear from them.
Me too. I like the idea of us. For folks who are newer to the podcast, we're trying something out by having folks, sort of, to Nick's point, who have taken different strategies in the market to compare and contrast and see how they have won and why they win. It's funny, I was reflecting on this. And so we had a guest a couple of shows back, Scott Kapoor from Andreessen. And Andreessen really changed the game, right, when it comes to value-add services. So like sort of a quick history lesson for folks. VCs have been around since, call it the 1970s. And for a long time, it was exactly what you said, Nick, right? It's the value is the money and the insights you get from the individual and maybe the firm-wide. And you had onesie twosies. Like I remember back in the day, Greylock had this talent partner that was like just extraordinary. And there was like one talent partner that was the big deal. And then in 2015, I might be off by a day or two, but it was that year they hired DJ to be their head of data science. And that was like, oh my God, a whole new thing. And then you get Andreessen on the scene 15 years ago, and they were like, no, we're going to surround the CEOs with value-added services, with BD and with talent and with marketing and corporate development and all the developments. And the world just changed, right? And then it felt like table stakes. And now to your point, there's this interesting sort of what is the craft of venture and who's crafting it and who's not crafting it. And then just to go back to our guests, they're both in the sort of seed end of the market, which is so fragmented, so competitive. You live in this stage of the market, Nick. Like it is tougher. It is tough today. And so seeing folks who have picked different ways of doing it, I think is just a really great way of exploring different ways of winning.
Totally. Yeah. And I think the point of this conversation today is not to pick a winner amongst these two firms, but obviously just highlight and showcase different ways of doing this. and different approaches, and how those approaches can speak to founders and LPs in totally different ways.
Yes, because the good news would be if you can win doing multiple different kinds of strategies. I think my very strong perspective after doing this for multiple decades is if there was only one way to win, we'd know exactly what that way is. So obviously picking great companies is a winning way, but how do you get to those companies to then pick you is, I think, the question we're going to unpack.
Yeah, not a winner take all game. Otherwise, there'd be one venture capital firm. Maybe that would be Andreessen, and hopefully that's not the case in the next decade to come for all of us. The LP job would be a lot less interesting.
But simpler.
It's simpler, I guess. So, yeah, I think this is going to be a great conversation, and let's bring them in.
Let's do it.
What's up, guys? Thank you for joining us.
Thanks for the invite.
You guys are two very well-respected GPs at two very different firms. So excited to dig in with you both on that. As a place to start, if you guys could just introduce yourselves and your firms, that would be fantastic.
Sure. Will Quist, one of the three GPs at Slow Ventures. I don't really know. I mean, it's kind of simple. We're an early stage venture capital firm. I think our most recent fund was 195 million early, 130 late stage. I mean, I think some of my partners are very public out there in the world saying we think 95% of venture capitalists don't actually practice venture capital.
Why, Jason, I want to get to you, but why do you think that 95% of VCs don't practice venture capital?
Because I think a lot of them aren't looking for the novelty. I think a lot of them are looking to find small bits of knowns and bet on those knowns expanding and replicating versus funding the exploration of unknowns, which is fine, and I think is a great way to make returns. But I really think venture capital is being capital to run an experiment against something that can be definitively true or false and be wildly equity efficient and valuable. I think what gets misunderstood in that is companies can have venture capital moments throughout their life cycle. I mean, it's why people talk about the S curves. I think each kink in the S curve comes from a novel hypothesis being correct and wildly valuable. So people take it to mean that it's got to be the first money in or not, but I really think about it as kind of testing and proving capital for something that can be important and valuable. It just turns out really good companies only need a little bit of equity out of the gate, and then they can self-fund a lot of their experiments. But I think we're increasingly finding companies that will go through the motions and later in their life find another curve. And so I think that's kind of how I've convinced myself it's a true definition of venture capital. It's not necessarily wedded to the stage or valuation, but to the purpose of the money.
I have so many more questions, but Jason, why don't you introduce yourself first and Primary?
Yeah. So Jason Shuman, general partner at Primary Venture Partners. Firm was started back in 2015. Our model's quite a bit different, I guess, from Slow's. We try to provide what many would probably consider to be an unreasonable amount of resources to try to create unfair advantages for the portfolio companies we work with. Each of the investors here does 3, maybe 4 deals a year. We have about 35 people on our impact team who lean in across go-to-market, strategic finance, and then recruiting. And then we also incubate about 6 companies a year internally. Our most recent fund was $280 million for seed, and another like $160 million on the opportunity fund side.
We're going to get this going. Welcome, Will and Jason. How do you think folks define the S-curve in venture, Will? And like, what could you maybe explain that another level deeper?
I mean, think of the S-curve as the valuation. Like you're graphing the valuation of the company, right? Is how I think about it. And so hey, I've got an idea. It might be correct. Let's put some money in and test it correct. Hey, it's correct. Oh, wow. Just by being correct, this company is dramatically more valuable. Then there's usually a little more valuation to be had in proving that what was true replicates. But markets are pretty efficient. So once it's known, they pull forward a lot of that value, right? And so then the top of the S-curve kicks in, and then you're looking for another act of the company. Now the time horizons on the X-axis can come and go, but that's That's how I picture, right? Really looking for things where if they're true, they're just unassailably wildly valuable.
How do you guys like discover those pockets of unknowns? Because I imagine it's very different for slow and for primary.
I think for us, the pockets of unknown are probably actually the same as Will's. I imagine we are trying to go out and create a set of hypotheses when we're evaluating a company, or we like to call them as gotta believes. They're things that you can go out and validate during the course of diligence. And the way that we try to go out and do that is by building essentially customer networks and expert networks across every sector that we can go to once we meet a company. And then we can go and ask those questions to figure out, will there be demand on the commercial side if you are able to build such technical product? And are you going to be able to scale it at a customer acquisition cost that we think will create efficient unit economics? And so for us, it's just about either going out and trying to validate that if the founders have not already, or if we've backed a company already, then trying to accelerate the validation of those experiments.
I'm going to ask a follow-up stereotypical LP question. I think for this podcast, I might just try to be all the stereotypes in LP land. We'll see how that works. So it sounds to me like this is a little bit in the figuring out where you want to invest, right? And sort of the sourcing, but then in the winning. And one of the things Nick and I were talking about prior was that seed investing into early A now is, we can talk about whether or not A is the same or not, but like seed is hyper competitive right now. It's fragmented, it's busy, big funds, small funds. Will's giving me a side look. Maybe he doesn't think so. But assuming it's competitive, how do you then position your firms to win, right? In the staying in this articulation of who you are as slow and who you are as primary, like how does that help win? Because I'm just going to go with the hypothesis. You guys could both like the same company. Maybe you come at it from different reasons, but you both might like it. How do you then get them to like you back? This is the LP version of how do you win the deal, right?
We got to give up our secret sauce, Will. You want to go first?
Yeah, I mean, ours is, again, lucky to have a partner like Sam who's on record with everything so that I can borrow it. But I mean, I think our answer is like, we want to do deals that aren't competitive. I mean, I think there's a general belief that if 15 other people can figure something out, I think a lot of the alpha might be gone.
So you will literally not give a term sheet if other people show up, just to push on that point.
I mean, you can spot it. Like, you don't show up to something and be like, I really like this in 14 people. You know what I mean? The Valley is efficient enough that a deal that is going to make it through 15 judgment filters kind of arrives pretty simultaneously on everybody's desk. So I think number one is this, we don't have to do like Jason, we're kind of like 3 to 4 core deals per partner per year. So we don't have to do everything. I think is another, right? I mean, I think we're in the returns business, not the get it back, not the ship it out. So I think that's number one. I've come to, I don't know if I would have agreed with that 9 years ago, but I do think there is some merit to trying to understand things the bulk of the market can't understand as being a kind of a starting place on how do you win deals. But honestly, I would say, especially over the last 2 years, it's been a lot more for us feeling, and that's kind of why I gave a bit of a chuckle sideways glance, is like, it has felt like more of a return to 7 or 8 years ago where we're finding things where we can be collaborative with people because it's not well understood by the entire vanguard of early stage.
I think in a perfect world, we're trying to find deals as well that aren't competitive, and we're finding them earlier than other folks. But the reality ends up being that we end up in competitive situations pretty frequently, and no one's going to sell your firm quite as well as the founders that you've worked with in the past. However, I would also say we have a lot of younger partners here that have not been in the business for 10 plus years. And so how do you enable them to go out and win deals? And for us, I think one, it's bringing a prepared mind into meetings. You know, I think Pat Grady talked about when he was fresh out of Summit Partners, he would walk into a meeting and express his thesis in a market. And that's how he used to get founders to buy into such a young person in that meeting. But the second is running a very tight process. And so that expert network I talked about before, we can get you on 3 to 5 sales calls within 48 hours. And those are people you want to talk to, because sales is not only about closing a deal and getting revenue. But I think I saw Will retweet something about, research, and we can get you that research faster. And then we come in and introduce you to our impact team, and you meet partners here who can teach you about things like go-to-market strategies and positioning, or how you should be setting up literally a job packet out of the gates, and things that a lot of founders in the early days have never done before because they haven't touched every function of a business more likely than not. And then that helps us go out and try to win the deal.
Nick, do you want to share how you do it?
We now looking back of like 10 years of data, the data definitely suggests that all the returns have come from the very few things that no one else cared about when we invested. In fact, I don't think there was a single, what I would view as like consensus investment that actually made us any money. So, and maybe I'd be curious to hear from Jason or Will, like if that data suggests something different, but so that's definitely real.
Well, I mean, that's definitely embedded in our approach too. I mean, we've got a long list of personal and kind of slow 1.0 investments, and now 9 years and 4 funds worth of slow 2.0 investments. And I think the data would mirror that pretty closely. And I don't know that we, till the last couple of years, really internalized that.
Yeah.
And realize, I mean, this is where it goes to novel thesis, unknowns. I mean, our LPs are tired of hearing us talk about consensus, non-consensus, but I think it's real. And that doesn't mean you don't fall in love with something that 15 people can't figure out. But I think it's kind of anchoring towards this side of how can we get excited? How can we figure out the risk, right? The asymmetry and the risk reward when other people can. And I think that's driven the overwhelming majority of the value in our slow funds.
I've been thinking a lot more about like research. I've found in the past for me, whenever I go down a research rabbit hole, I end up like, I don't know, just finding something that's like totally orthogonal or different and unrelated that sort of blows my mind, that then leads, like I've found research holes for me are often dead ends. And like, if I'm thinking about it and researching it, that probably means like 47 people have already thought about it and researched it already. And so like, how do you think about like novel or original research or insights? Like to a certain degree, if a VC is researching it, it might be too late.
I would argue otherwise. I think that one thing that investors have is access pretty frequently to potential users and buyers of products that many folks in the ecosystem don't have access to. And so one of the things that we've done is we've shared information across every specialization area of what business models are starting to really take off and what value propositions, and how can they be applied to the other specializations internally, which then if we're jumping on a call with 20 CTOs, or I cover prop tech, so like 20 VPs of construction, and you're asking them questions, some of which might have to do with that other business model, but others have to do with what are their pain points day to day. You might come across things that only one or two other people out there would even be thinking about because they're not that deep in the market. And so I do think that for us though too, and I'll say like, because we have so many resources, we have a little bit of extra time to do this type of work. And then we're inspired to do it because we're incubating so many companies as well.
I'm trying to figure out how to not turn this into like Professor Will on a whiteboard. So, and say these things succinctly. But,
we like Professor Will. It's cool.
I think it's a little, there's two answers. One is like, do you actually look at your thinking, sharing, research as a marketing piece? Which I think a lot of venture capital firms, well, I'm going to use the consensus definition of venture capital and not mine despite everything that tenses up in me. Are you using it as marketing or not? Right. So I think that's number one. And I think there's a lot of people, and the issue with marketing is you kind of fully bake it all the way so that it's safe and sane and passes the brand test and doesn't have cross-examination. So I think there's that. There's a lot of research under that, guys, in the venture community and would argue that really well-formulated stuff that holds up under cross-examination is probably pretty efficient just because the amount of time and work it takes to get there. And then I'd cross that, or point number two would be like, it's kind of a function of how creative you're willing to be. And again, I give a lot of credit to my partner, Sam. Sam shares a lot. He's not always right. And so it's kind of this, how comfortable are you getting creative and being wrong? And that was something I learned 10 or 15 years ago from someone who's really good at this. That like, you don't want to share when you're 80% convinced you have the right answer. You know what I mean? You want to share when you're interested in the answer and let them I think Fred Wilson said this, so that you want to make it a conversation. And I think that's listen, our research, I can guarantee you, is not nearly as comprehensive as what primary does. I mean, it's, hey, this is an interesting theme, right? Why do we think it's interesting? Let's pull it together. Let's make sure we believe it more than we don't believe it, but let's share it and find out where we're wrong. And so I think that's my answer on how you can kind of have your own novel thinking and take it externally and do it in a way that at least has some interesting glimmer of light. I would say the other part is, I think too many take it too far. Like markets are pretty efficient and wise. Like you don't want to go, non-consensus means like the market is wrong, I am right. I think you want to be, hey, you're not thinking about this thing that we're thinking about. And you really want to find the 1% to 2% breakage in the market. Like markets are companies and industries operate the way they do for very logical reasons. And the idea that you're going to find something 90% wrong with an industry, I think is a flawed premise versus find something that's 2 to 3 to 4% off. Right. And then you can mine within there.
One of the things that Will said that I think is interesting is about the idea of being non-consensus, which you can only be non-consensus for so long. And you better have a deep pocketbook where you can write more and more checks until they get to the point where they become consensus. And we've certainly seen it play out in a few different companies over the years. Like Alloy is a business in our portfolio that we wrote 3 checks when they had 0 revenue, but eventually the market caught up. And I think when you talk to even IA about Datadog, it was the exact same thing. So I think oftentimes these non-consensus bets, it's that the market needs to catch up to them in order for them to end up playing out.
And even there, again, I know we're like flip-flopping terminology at Slow, but even there, I've just learned to be cautious about getting too excited that I'm right and the market's wrong versus they're just not thinking about it yet, or there isn't, they have no opinion. You know what I mean? But there's not enough evidence. I think so much of this game is about known founders and known problems with known business models. And I think you can deviate, but again, you can't deviate and do 3 unknowns in a row. I mean, I can talk longer. That's my shorthand of it. But I think we've just learned the slope to climb of like fully the market's wrong, I'm right, is kind of an asymmetric trade against you in most situations. I get it. For me, it's very akin to friends that will short in the public markets. Like you learn quickly, you don't do that on valuation. You know what I mean? Like you don't ever do that on price because the market's wrong and I'm right about the price or value of this business. And they're looking for much stronger objective catalysts. So if you are going to do market is wrong, I am right, it can't just be on belief. It's got to be on this specific single threaded catalyst is why the market is wrong. But again, I think we tend towards much more towards like, oh, we're just thinking about things others might not be thinking it.
Can I also ask, here's my second stereotypical LP question for the day. I'm going to ask the money question, which is everyone says you want to be contrarian and right. I heard you both all kind of saying that to make the money in it. Is that because you get better valuations and you get more ownership? I know I'm asking what sounds like a bit of a nidgy little niche money math question, but why is that better in your fund unless it can outperform, right? Because and then maybe it doesn't matter what the valuation is going in because you find something that's right and it just takes off to the moon. And that's what we all want for the power laws. Does it matter how competitive it is and how many term sheets, unless it cares about valuation and ownership?
The short answer from my perspective is seed is still the least efficient part of the chain in venture capital. So because of that specifically, you can be a little bit more consensus if you're getting there early, because you're originating deals oftentimes, in a way, for Series A, Series B firms and beyond. And if there are a few massive waves every 3 years that are in the market and will generate 95% of the returns in venture capital, you want to make sure that you're riding those waves. And so for us, at least at Seed, I'm okay overpaying by 20-25%, if we believe that should be one of the 4 deals that we're doing, that year. But at the same time, a contrarian bet, being non-consensus can create a lot of additional risks downstream for financing.
Yeah, I mean, my answer is way simpler and more anecdotal, which is like, I think businesses that go on to be really important don't present obviously that way on day 0. Like, I think if you just reverse engineer the important companies that have driven results for venture capital firms, over the years, like I think it's less about valuation, and they just don't present on day zero with so many knowns, right? I think there are exceptions, right? Things that can be priced. So like exceptions kind of prove the rule though. Like Samsara is one of those, right? It was like priced efficiently, super competitive, 100, I mean, okay.
Yeah, maybe,
But I think
maybe Square. I mean, there's a few, but I hear, the Facebooks and Airbnbs and
they were weird.
Solanas, and they were really weird. Yeah.
They were weird. And so I think that's more Beezer than it is valuation and ownership. Is I'm not sure companies that zig with the paradigm versus zag present straightforward enough out of the gate for 15 to 20 firms to understand it and be willing to pay a premium price way above risk reward.
Awesome. I love it. All right, Nick, back to you. Kick us off with the big question that we probably should have started with, but we're going to get to it now.
The question in a nutshell is, can we actually change the trajectory for companies? I mean, Primary has built a big platform. Andreessen has built a gigantic platform. Do they actually drive returns? Beezer and I were talking about before this around like how the pendulum seems to like swing on this question over the years, over the decade. And firms built out these platforms and maybe it swings the other way. It feels like we're maybe swinging towards somewhere in the middle. So I'm curious to hear both your guys' perspectives. There's a lot of VCs and LPs and founders that listen to this. So curious to hear your views.
We only build products internally that I think founders are really asking for. When I think about what a seed stage company ultimately needs to go and do, they need to go validate hypotheses as quickly as possible between seed and the Series A. And so if we think about it from a like pure first principles perspective, output equals number of hours that you're working, number of inputs, and like quality of inputs. And that goes across, by the way, every function. And a founder doesn't have that much time with a very small team. And for us, if we can lean in and work in certain ways to accelerate those things, you can start to increase the amount of hours, the number of inputs, and then potentially the quality of the inputs.
Are there examples of Primary actually changing the outcome for a company?
Sorry, can I clarify the question just to help make it more helpful for Jason, which
Please.
is like, are there examples of the platform team, right?
Yeah.
And not the GP. I mean, I think that's the real clarifier is like, is there the case studies of the platform team versus the GPs enabling that acceleration?
So the first thing I would say is we call it impact and not platform. Platform is a dirty word here. Platform teams just make introductions. Impact teams do things. So one of our companies that just completed a Series A, we set up 97 sales meetings for. That's a lot of sales meetings, and our conversion rate for outbound prospecting for that company was 8x that of the SDRs at that company. So I think that's one way we've added value. The second is we have a portfolio company called Dandy. It's in the dental space. Some people know about it. A lot of people don't. We've intentionally kept it quiet. But they went through a pivot back in 2020. That was a pivot that was driven pretty heavily by some research that we had done on B2B marketplaces and vertical integration. And the company went from 0 to nearly 200 million in revenue over the course of 3 years. Our impact team, Cassie Young, who's one of our general partners, she was interim CRO at one point in time for literally like 6 months because the first CRO didn't work out and they really needed help because they were on a rocket ship there. We have a chief people officer that was there who was basically spending 200 plus hours over the course of months recruiting folks and helping them really build the infrastructure out to go from what was literally 20 employees to almost 1,000 in a matter of 2 years. And then we've had a number of other people on the strategic finance side build models out for founders that have lasted them from a seed round all the way through like a Series C. And so I think that there are very real and very measurable impacts that we've had here. And candidly, like every single month, we're going over those metrics to make sure that the team's hitting the KPIs that we set out for them.
Jason, can I this is like, I don't have a horse in the race. I'm super actually interested. Like how do you think about the effect of this on the spectrum of steroids versus strength training?
So that's a really interesting analogy. I think about it. I think it's really steroids in many ways, but you can't get strong with steroids unless you are doing strength training. So what I mean by that is a great founder is going to be a learning machine, whether we are working with them or not. But if they are going to spend time going and learning from the best, and we can accelerate the speed of those learnings, or they're going to spend time going out and selling, which then takes them away from other learnings around how to manage people and how to recruit. Those are the places where we can actually add a lot of value. And the irony, by the way, is that the best founders in our portfolio that have had exits before and run publicly traded companies are the ones who use the impact team the most. And so that to me says, okay, they understand where they need to pull on resources, especially if they're going to end up being free.
Can you say more about that? Because that sort of counterpoints to the old adage, those people that are, whatever it is, like the best founders don't need any help. But you're saying this, the ones who are accomplished and experienced are like, yay, this is free help. Why would I not take it all day long?
That's exactly it. Yeah. If you're going to give me a recruiter and I don't need to go spend a few weeks trying to figure out who's going to be the best consulting firm on the recruiting side and I trust you, they're going to be okay with us helping there. If they see the 8x conversion rate difference between their SDRs and our market dev team, then they're going to want to lead into the resource that we can provide them there. They're just as commercial as we are at the end of the day.
I mean, that's interesting to me because those are people that like went through strength training though. You know what I mean? Like those are people who've been in the gym and built the fundamentals and the playbooks and understand it and have kind of been through the fire, which would, again, I don't know the right answer. I think, but this is part of the discussion we have on not having those resources. I mean, there's not having those resources is some of the Darwinism around doing this, figuring it out, forging yourself through the fire. I mean, I think it's one thread of the conversation we've had.
Yeah, like in other words, like, do you have to wean people off? Like at some point, and how do you do that?
Or do you find, I mean, again, what's the downside? What's the downside of, I mean, steroids aren't a free run. You know what I mean? Like you come at, it's not actual fundamental pervasive strength. You do have to be doing the strength training underneath. And I'm taking the analogy too far.
Well, two things. One, I would say when they have more cash and they have more time, it's easy for them to bring on a lot of those resources on their own after the seed. But number two, there are some companies that still leverage the market dev team at Series C and Series D. Now, we can't give them as many resources as we used to, but turns out when you're generating a significant amount of returns for a portfolio, you're going to do everything you can in your power to make sure they're successful.
So I'm fascinated to hear which KPIs you're comfortable sharing vis-a-vis what does that mean for how the company is proceeding? Like you need to do X, Y, Z to get to A, and is that how you measure it? And then you're like, oh, we're good spending this time, money, whatever, because of the trade is the milestones the company fundraises, or is it more about revenue generated?
Yeah. So we run a founder CSAT like every quarter on each of the individual functions, and it's both qualitative and quantitative. So like that's one way that we review it. But then each of those metrics, for instance, on the recruiting side, for instance, we have a dollars saved across the portfolio, a time to placement metric, which we typically compare directly to the portfolio companies when they're not using our team. And then we have a success rate metric, which is like how long is somebody in the seat on average that we end up placing. And don't get me wrong, like we've made plenty of hiring mistakes before, but we also have a cashback guarantee when it comes to like any of the companies, if they're ever paying for any sort of resource under the sun with us. The second thing is on the market dev side, it's a pretty easy to track metric when it comes to like, are we setting up meetings for you? And are those meetings closing? And how are we in comparison to the other SDRs? And then on the finance side, it's a little bit squishier just because we're building out the model and a lot of the infrastructure for some of these companies. So that has more to do with the CSAT score than anything.
It's fascinating. So Will, Slow does none of this. You do PhD program and then good luck? Come back home with lots of money?
No. I think it can be perceived that way sometimes. No, I mean, I think, yeah, we don't have anyone but who we have on the investment team helping companies out.
So that I'm not sure the right term is VC craft. As a sort of, do you know what I mean? As a way of, I think I know you use the term VC classic with Bryce, but I don't know what counts as classic anymore. Do you know what I mean? Like, so Yeah.
I mean, I think you do. The problem is it's just not that big and it's not that much AUM.
There's that. But also, yes, say more.
I listen, was lucky enough to grow up around the Valley. So when I think VC classic, I think the 70s, 80s, and early 90s is kind of where
I think so too, because I'm old, but I appreciate for a lot of people.
People call me an 86-year-old man in a 43-year-old body. I mean, I can tell you about the 1940s Stanford football team that turned into the venture capital asset class.
But for the last, Andreessen started 15 years ago, pioneered some of this model. So like for the last 15 years, that could count as classic depending on when. But you're saying that's not Slow's model, and you're no.
And I mean, I think more power to everyone to run their own playbook to generate returns.
I mean, I think you sell something, right? Like you actually
Maybe.
like, just to push
we sell.
back,
I mean,
'cause I'm
if I'm going to keep parroting, we sell money.
No, I think you actually sell more than that, because like I'm probably in the spectrum. I'm probably closer to the VCs don't really add any value and don't change the trajectory of companies. But I actually do think you and we actually do sell something. And I think to a certain degree, you're selling a certain level of trust with a founder, right? That might not be a value added service that you're like putting on the website or hiring another person, but like you have a relationship with the founder. That founder is picking you to work with beyond just the money.
Listen, I think my personal experience is 95 to 105% of the value I've ever seen generated came from the team themselves. I just can't find. So you can talk about, do VCs impact out? I don't think it's worth debating. Do outside forces shape the impact of companies? Like, yes. The question is, the important question to me is the magnitude to which you can shape the outcome. And I think if you look at Meta at this point and be like, do they 5% of that market cap go to the VCs? It's like, that's kind of a big number. So I mean, I think that's like the first part of the talk track that I genuinely believe. And so I think obviously number one is like, don't be -5. And I think that's overwhelmingly generous to outside forces. Like it's probably not even 5%, but don't be negative, right? Don't create unnecessary friction. Don't waste the founder's time. Don't get involved in places where you aren't the highest, most qualified person to be helpful, right? So I think we do a very good job with a lack of resources of not being -5%. And then I think the question is like, within that 5%, what's like the longest lever you can pull? And I think there's kind of three forces we think about. One is you can only have so much control and context as a minority equity investor, right? And so to have any substantial impact, you need to have a meaningful amount of context and a meaningful amount of control. And you need to do it somewhere where your skills are not only uniquely suited to you in the world, but where you think you're one of the best in the world at them.
I actually think we're more similar than many people think, especially when it comes to how like the investment teams think about applying their time. What Will was talking about is taking that first 18 to 24 months and implementing a certain style of teaching a man how to fish. And I think for us, we are trying to teach them how to fish, and they can guide us where they want to, because we're not ever telling them, hey, you need to go do this thing. It's just like, here's your menu. If you want anything, you can pick off of it, but you don't need to.
Jason and Will, thank you guys so much for joining us. We really appreciate it.
Oh, my pleasure to be here. This is always fun. I love talking this through. I'm always curious to hear what I actually think.
Well, Nick, Beezer, Will, this was fun. Thanks for having me, and sorry we didn't get too spicy for you.
Yeah, that was supposed to be spicy, but then you guys just ended up agreeing on everything. So next time.
And he said he was contrarian, you know?
Thanks, man. Appreciate it.
Great to talk.
Take care.
Thanks for listening to Origins.
Be sure to tune in next time for a new bonus episode where Nick and I unpack what we've learned today and discuss how it's impacted the way we see the world of capital.
You can find that right here in this feed. And while you're there, please rate and review the podcast. We super appreciate it. And it is very helpful for other folks that are looking for venture insights to be able to find our show.
Origins is produced by OpenLP, a resource for the venture ecosystem from Sapphire Partners, and in partnership with Pod People and Nick, and I'm Beezer Clarkson.
I'm Nick Chirls. We'll be back soon. Thank you for listening.